So what kind of poetics am I referring to, and why would it be relevant or interesting in a working group on language ideologies in this human-machine context we are dealing with? So this is the outline of the talk, where I'm trying to look at those questions. We'll first consider some distinctions between poetics and art of language, which is like an ambivalence and a confusion that at times arises. Then we'll look at endangerment as part of these risks and harms vocabulary. And following, we'll be focusing on the point actually on endangered poetics and some questions about emergent poetics. So the term poetics triggers many associations, while for many it is just a manifestation of the art of language, as literary creation. For others, it's rather a perspective. So this is the sense of poetics I'm interested in, and I'll focus on. Not poetry as a genre, but as a particular awareness of the world, as a perspective. We can consider different poetical ideologies. So we have the cognitive, which is like probably the one that we have more present in our culture. This ideational that some authors have wonderfully described as a musical thought in this approach to the extreme, as George Schneider, when he says, is there some kindred sense of poetry and music of thought deeper than that which attaches to the external uses of language, style, literature itself? This has been deployed actually in some branch, which is this called Poetics of Knowledge, which is some niche probably for some obscure French and German authors, but that also reflects on this tendency. Poetic perspective involves then attention both to detail and synthesis, meaning on multiplicity, unpredictability, variability, and at the same time on unity and commonality. Poetics as an instinct to explore the conceptual potential of the human, which is not expressed, so beyond grammaticalization, beyond lexicalization or institutionalization. So this is an exploration, as we know, led by poets and non-poets, so researchers, scientists, political activists, anyone so inclined. From a second perspective, the poetics lies in the intellectual, in what we could call a prosthetics of communication, which unveils the interactional origin of language, its bodily grounding. From a third and primitive perspective, the poetic would refer to its origin, actually, to the traditional poiesis, which involves creation, action, transformation. This notion entails in some approaches, for instance, in philosophical anthropology, could refer to as participation, not participation in a political sense, but in a metaphysical sense of the human, really as part, an integrating part of the whole of reality, not as an agent separated from it as from modernity. So poetics would be here like a technology to tune to the environment. Poetic language is a cultural control of nature to bring about order, cosmos. Beauty being just one accidental kind of collateral effect sort of thing that only became a value of independent entity later in culture. So why all these discussions? It's because our ideas and beliefs about language, so our language ideologies, belong to a bigger matrix, the matrix of language in the human imagination, so which is to a great extent a manifestation of that poetics we're talking about, because it belongs to a matrix of how humans are co-created by language. Language is a technology in its various stages up to the latest developments of NLP. And because it also belongs to the matrix of what we believe that can be done with language, so its poetic potential. This set of ideas and beliefs generate a diversity of language and communication ideologies that are variable in time and space. So if we quickly see some of these examples of variability, we can think, for instance, in the actuary, in this wonderful work of language in the Amerindian imagination, where we find this community between Ecuador and Peru. They, as many other cultures in similar contexts, make the difference between the spoken language that is spoken by bodies and the universal language that would be like conveying the intersubjectivity and communication with the beings of the world. They experience it as communication from the soul, and transforms every plant, animal, every being in the context in a subject capable of meaning. So this would resonate actually with more contemporary approaches to languages in the post-humanist approach to linguistics, where we have to the center the human and consider the relation between humans, languages, and non-humans alike in a continuum. So this is a cross-species subjectivity that is enacted by this ideology of communication. For the Jiva on the side, we find the reports of also this fascinating work in Teaming Goat, where he highlights the fact that in this culture, truth of things is not just apprehended, but it's experienced through experience, grasped by experience, and in particular through communication in different levels of consciousness and of reality. For the Jiva, truth has to be tested many times through oniric personal experience. So to be a competent Ojibwa speaker sort of way of talking, you have to be competent in different registers of different layers of reality. So you have to be polyglot in a universe of several beings that express in several tones, and you have to tune to these voices to be a competent speaker of the system, of the ecology. If we go to the Aurora, Mikkel Silverstein reports how probably he was very young as an anthropologist at that point, but then he really embodied the knowledge that there is no such a thing as significant signifier, or the structural linguistic things were crumbling. He could see how meaning was contextual in any case, and understanding is really being transformed. So understanding is not just a mental approach, but it's a transformation of the being. So in all those examples, conceptions about language and communication don't exist per se as constructs, but hand in hand with the experience of relationality and action and tuning to the environment. Those are taken to be the basic dimensions of those communication ideologies, in which at times the construct language doesn't even exist. In the case of the Ache in Paraguay, they only were aware of this construct once they were confronted with other ones, such as Spanish and Guarani, for instance. So this table shows schematically some themes defining our language. I have highlighted in yellow some basic tenets of what we can call a standard average European language ideology defined by Ramsey. So we know in this workshop, I think these definitions have been repeated many, many times. Probably it's not the time to go again, but just to remember the dualism of words and things, thought versus action, real world events versus ways of talking about them, etc. An ideology that, taken extreme, has been inherited up to current approaches to language technologies. So non-highlighted in blue, we see the other approaches to language and communication ideologies, including those examples just described. So we see how this highlighted area corresponds to a view of language as a lexical code divorced from social functions, as Bert puts it, and also divorced from a sense of poiesis and poetics in relation to the environment, as the broad sense that we had mentioned before. Digital systems need refined data that can be generalized, made equivalent in order to be processed. They need to reduce those diverse communication ecologies to homogeneous codes. In other words, that process involves generalizing a local language communication ideology, the one in yellow, as we mentioned, and to generalize it as a global design. So this global design of digital systems, refined data, require monologic speech recordings that clean the acoustic environment with no hallmarks of embodied communication. Quantity and quality are reduced to scalar measures, such as letter size, letter rate, etc., etc. So, by the way, I use the phrase local communication ideologies, global designs, as a paraphrase of this book. I don't know if you're aware of with this author, Local Histories and Global Designs. The title this author, I'm informed that my internet connection is unstable. I hope that it keeps being okay. As I say, this work by Walter Mignolo, who presents the asymmetries of power in the post-colonial geopolitics of knowledge. So this is just a paraphrase that we can find really well translated by these proportions of languages that we are quoting here, where for a fraction of the world's languages, perhaps no more than 10%, the dominant ideologies that a language is a communication tool, a public corpus, readily interchangeable with others, for data, for commercial exploitation by algorithms, etc. For the remaining 90%, language tends to be oral, emergent, and translatable, tightly coupled to a place. And consequently, to a great extent, wedded to a protostatic notion of interaction and relation to the environment, an experience of relationality as in this metaphysic participation that is been fading away. That asymmetry of 1090 reminds us of the vocabulary of endangerment. There is the well-known endangerment of named languages. We're very familiar with those statements that at current rates, about 90% of languages of the world will become extinct in the next 100 years. But there is also this endangerment of communication and linguistic ideologies really linked to a poetic approach of human existence. To what extent this entails an endangered poetics of the human at large? So if we go to this vocabulary of risks and harms and frame endangerment here, we know that risks induce harms and endangerment of forms of life and culture counts among them, a vocabulary that has been spread through the risk society introduced by Beck and Giddens. And we can frame the risk, harms, and endangerment approach in a sequence from the macro to the micro in the context of the digital, and to assess and to put some order in some scattered inputs that we receive with media and every other kind of forum. Some weeks ago, we saw this famous open letter issued by the Future of Life Institute calling for a pause of giant AI experiments, framed in terms such as should we risk loss of control of our civilization, etc. So this rhetoric is fueled often by apocalyptic metaphors and science fiction narratives. And while these macro AI systems, in their hypothetical way from artificial general intelligence to artificial superintelligence, may potentially exterminate us, in the process they are appreciated for the metaphors they inspire. So as speculative models of potential omniscience, omnipotence, and supreme consciousness, these artificial intelligence are rich poetic devices, some would argue. These approaches, and we also find Nick Bostrom, of course, the author of Superintelligence, that invites us to think of AI as a primordial force of nature, like a star system or a hurricane, very strong but indifferent. This notion of indifference will be crucial later. So this approach is opposed by other styling critical AI, such as the one suggested by Distributed AI Research Institute with Timnit Gebru and others who claim that what we should be focusing on are in the actual harms happening now. This is, for instance, the case of reports such as ethical and social risks of harm from language models that make emphasis on bias, discrimination, exclusion, or the classical debates in AI ethics. It's worth to note, though, that at times more critical authors consider this as probably as actions that are the result of what they call corporate funded AI fairness. That's actually what they do is no more than cleaning up the ethic issues after the event. So that is a critical approach that is trying to be nuanced by other authors. So in the same kind of block of common controversies, we can find Emily Bender too, and she was giving this talk some months ago about the ways in which AI involves dehumanization. She was relating especially some points such as computational metaphors, so very well-known topics that were reunited here under this optics. Digital physiognomy that had been discredited in the past but now has returned with some dignification through the simulacrum of rationality and trustworthily conveyed by computation. Ground lies, of course, as an ironic paraphrase of ground truths. All the worst work involved, humans as hidden software components. And then she was highlighting this irrationality aspect that is crucial also here, where ironically, algorithmic decision making is perceived as more just or fair because of the computational extremely rational approach. But on the other hand, anytime algorithms mistreat users, they deny the way to interact with them. So while all these approaches to critical AI are tackling really fundamental issues, I am focusing on the work of a third view that could be would be considered like the micro ethics of the whole issue. So it's not the super structures of the big problems of the defect, as some authors say, but the ontologies behind those ethics. This is especially the work of this professor in Durham, Louisa Moore, that in her Cloud Ethics, Algorithms and the Attributes of Ourselves, draws a distinction between ethics as a code, like these regulations of what is permitted or forbidden, and ethics as the relation of oneself to oneself and to others. So this is an ethics really linked to ontology and a macroscopic approach that is really, I think, heuristically very powerful. At this poetic approach I'd like to highlight. In fact, actually, what she's doing is to look closely to the way of how persons, communities, and relationality are defined, are designed, and are enforced in algorithmic systems. This means that instead of an ethics that tackles the issues after the event, she explores the ways through which ML algorithms create our basic ontologies. So although she never refers to the poetic underpinnings or consequences of that exploration, I think that it offers these fertile heuristics in that regard. Also, in parallel, this is an approach truly resonant with the longest-standing commitment of STS that things could be otherwise. I therefore engage with Moore's Cloud Ethics as a toolkit, I would say, to identify hotspots of an endangered poetics of the human, where this potential for relationality with others and the environment is revealed and affected. So let's look at an example of how different technologies, natural language and algorithms, approach and construct bodies, humans and persons. So this is we'll come back to Amur later to look at this problem. But now I'm proposing this comparison. So we have this image. Let's assume that we construct this seed in English in terms of they might go. To speak English and convey what we're seeing, the sentence would be enough saying who is going and by which modality of action, right? So it's be processed in a language that displays a different set of categories, of obligatory categories, such as Lalaban, this polysynthetic Australian language in Arnhem-Land. To say they might go, containing information about who is doing what and according to which modality of action, we have to first start with the basic meaning go. Normally it's born, but when taking about high respect relatives, we have to use a different form, which is dokan. So first, check out the kinship relation. Second, you have to put the prefix nokun because it would denote that the action is being carried out surreptitiously, so in a sneaky way, without letting someone know who should have known about it. So you need to know whether these two people are keeping the right people informed about what they are doing. Then you add marnu, which represents the event as having some effect on others. Then you need to specify whether two or more people are going, and if there is some kinship relationship bonding them. Finally, you add the apprehensive prefix we. I'm following here the description of Nicholas from his work that works to depict the situation as undesirable. Evans has translated here this prefix with "I'm afraid that," but in another context, such as if you wish to advise a more competent person to make sure that the two do not go, a better translation would be "so that they don't end up," a kind of a preemptive kind of prefix. So literally, once we have obtained this word, literally meaning, I'm afraid the two who are in odd-numbered generations with respect to one another might go with consequences for someone else and without a key person knowing about it. By choosing the form of words I do, I hereby indicate that one of those carrying out the action is a mother-in-law of mine or equivalently respected relative. Okay, so in the case of this language and of many others in small-scale societies that have similar systems of categorization and social cognition in grammar, we're in the domain of those 90% of languages for which language tends to be emergent and untranslatable, tightly coupled to a place. Those are these communication ideologies where ecologies where the individual notion of personhood, meaning like one individual is in its embedding in society, is more than one and at the same time is less than one. There is this anthropological notion of individual versus individuals. These notions tend to permit the system and are encoded in grammar. So to plan and decode the Dalabon word that we've seen, we need to bring in several elements of social cognition. We have to locate the event and specify if it's undesirable. We have to indicate the social ramifications of it. We have to describe the event as being known or not to someone whom it concerns. And then we, of course, have to use some lexical item to model the social relationships involved. So let's look at a different but resonant mode of framing social cognition, in this case, of setting up an algorithm to obtain an output after exposure, also like in the Dalabon case, to a social scene, to some people gathering. It is to explore, it is to, I keep hearing a bit, but I don't know if it's so it is to explore the second example that I'm turning to Amur's cloud ethics. Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old African-American man, died in the hands of the Baltimore Police Department in April 2015. These people gathered on Baltimore streets to protest the killing. Those streets were monitored by a set of machine learning algorithms that have been supplied to the Baltimore police by the tech company Geophilia. So in these Geophilia algorithms, we see how these techniques are based on protest monitoring software working in the same way, in the following way. This software typically develops are expert in machine learning algorithms for anomaly detection that are displayed by a protest monitoring dashboard that outputs risk scores of upcoming threats of civil unrest in different locations of the geography area concerned. The score on the dashboard is the singular output of deep neural network algorithms that have been trained to recognize the attributes of public life, the norms and the anomalies that are latent in the data streams extracted from multiple sources, from social networks to all sorts of databases. So this process would be roughly defined in this way. We have these massive data sources where some patterns in the data streams are identified. They are translated into clusters of data that will be attributes of urban public life, but also would be like attributes of all sorts of other social contexts. These attributes are learned by the machine And these learned attributes would be means to identify the future attributes of yet unknown subjects or unknown scenes in the future. So this would be an output of the propensities of the assembled people protesting Grace murder. This is an example. Several known sovereign citizens have begun to post social media attempting to rally persons to demonstrate. Recorded the Baltimore Police Department, and then they went on saying that we'll continue to evaluate threat systems and follow all actionable leads. To obtain this, we've needed terabytes of images, video, audio, text, and biometric and geospatial data from the protests of the people of Baltimore during those days of civil unrest. And they were rendered as inputs to these deep learning algorithms. The consequence is that people were arrested and detained based on the outputs of a series of algorithms that had learned how to recognize what a protest is, what a gathering of people in the city might mean. For example, one of these actionable outputs were translated in these terms. Groups of high school students were prevented from boarding buses downtown because the output of the algorithm had adjudicated on their high risk they posed on the crowd. Although Taliban had 3 speakers left back in 2018, it looks like its grammar of social cognition has been revived in the spirit of these anomaly detection algorithms. Both methods have been refined to categorize and assess individual collective bodies and their propensities, but with some important differences. These differences will indeed depend on the background notion of the human and of society that is reigning in each case. They will depend on the notions of where bodies, humans, persons end and begin, and when bodies cross the threshold of the political or the social risk. If we compare our 2 algorithms, so the rule-based Dalabon natural language one and the deep neural network algorithm of anomaly detection, we'll see in parallel that to utter the word Dalabon, we need to bring in several elements of social cognition in grammar. We have, and at the same time, to output the risk score of upcoming threats of civil unrest, the algorithm also needs to bring elements of risk society cognition. So in both cases, there is an I that locates the event and indicates something other on attitudes by specifying if the action is undesirable or needs to be preempted. In the case of the algorithm, the attributes will be dangerous, anomaly detection, and finally an actionable output. In the second place, we have to indicate if the event will have a broader social ramification. In the case of the algorithm, there will be a security threat. Place, we have to look at the consequences for the society of minds. In that case, I depict the event as being unpaid known to someone whom it concerns. In the case of the algorithm, they would be the police. In the case of Dalabon, probably would be like the owner of the clan lands or the recipient of a planned trust, because it also can be like a sneaky action in the benefit of someone else. In the case of the algorithm, we'll find these people that should be informed and are not still yet, the police department, security officers, corporate interests, etc. While the Dalabon is foreseen a lexical strategy to model social relationships, that's not the case for the algorithm, where we find like one more time the enacting of irrationality that had been mentioned. So in the case of Dalabon, the I that is executing the action is a speaker of a natural language, Dalabon, that is embodied in the contextual modality of personhood. In the case of the algorithm, it has been designed by a tech company at the center of interests. So this process is grounded on and is reproducing the construct person as is established in its society. And it's serving the values of that society. Of course, in the Dalabon algorithm, the output is reproducing the social grammar of a smaller scale society. And we've seen that the grammar is produced sort of bottom up, while in the case of the algorithm, it is a top-down grammar that is devised to preserve a particular order. But also, again, the difference is that the attributes of the algorithm will be generalized across domains. So we'll have homogenizations of the attributes and the concepts that have been like elicited by the mechanical systems. So what makes the bringing up this example not just as anecdotal, but as an alert of how the categorization is not not limited to a single, is spreading the metaphors across others. On the second hand, the output is in the case of the algorithm is actionable. So it's not just a statement of a situation or of a state of affairs, it's actionable. It's even kind of resonating of the traditional poiesis where the word is acting and having a power and impact on the environment. In this case, we have we have like these groups of students that have been prevented from boarding buses because the output of the algorithm had been adjudicated on the high risk. Also, the things that this actionable output being prevented from moving or being prevented from some other action is the consequence of inferences that are based on the clusters of attributes of other people that are known to these affected subjects. So this involves a reflection on how personhood is constructed in these two cases. In the Dalabon, we have the individual modality of personhood, which is fractal, is socially embedded, is distributed in social relations. One is always more and less than one in a traditional sense. We have then the stage of modern languages and liberal subjects where we have the autonomy of the individual. Of course, this is simplifying. There is individuals and individuals in every social context, but we are putting this sort of extreme caricature for the sake of comparison. And in the case of the machine learning algorithm, clusters of inferred attributes in the algorithmic subject are constituting, again, a individual modality of personhood, like back in the traditional modern societies. Again, one is always more and less than one. The difference, of course, is like, as mentioned, the grammar work bottom up or top down, and that in the second case, we're producing an irrelational system where social relations are modeled. We can move to a second dimension of this poetics of the human that is endangered, and that is very closely related to this construct of personhood. Contemporary algorithms are used across different domains, from credit card fraud to voter preferences, as we saw in Cambridge Analytica, to counterterrorism, to recommendation systems even. That involves that the security approach to personhood we have described also generalizes across domains, I've mentioned. How it works, we have this grammar of attribution, what a human grouping is, what the propensities of those individuals are when their being together in space reaches a critical threshold that requires action. Meaning the grammar meaning the generation of actionable outputs. It's not just stating the state of affairs, it has actual consequences in society. These actionable outputs translate into denying rights, into preventing from doing things. And this grammar of attribution is being generalized at this domain, shaping what a human body, a social gathering, the limits of personhood are, not just in the security context, but across other contexts of society. In her project Algorithmic Societies, for instance, Amour is exploring some unrelated domains and how metaphors work, how their approaches cross between them. For instance, in their group, they are looking at how behavioral biometrics for banking fraud preventions, for instance, to what extent it crosses with biomedical recognition, from criminal justice scoring to consumer recommendation, from anomaly detection for security to prevent cyber attacks to oncology treatment pathways, etc. So those generalizations grounded in the humanizing metaphors can be actually seen as an additional vector of poetic ethics endangerment of the human. Because if we look back at those initial notes in the talk, poetics is an instinct to explore the conceptual potential of the human beyond grammaticalization, lexicalization, and other conceptual limits. So the fact that algorithms are used across domains, that these dehumanizing metaphors are spread across themes, introduces the notion of indifference, an element that runs also counter to another principle of poetics. We say that we would like to focus both on detail and multiplicity and predictability, variability, and on those only after those considerations focus on unity and commonality. This generalization, which is blind, is really running counter of this. So this indifference, actually, this neutrality is not unknown to us. In natural languages, we found, of course, the neutrality in grammatical elements. In the grammatical scaffolding, we have plenty of those examples. But via language technologies, this indifference is widely expressed as a generalized, we could call, indolence of the system. Other lines of reflection of this endangerment of the poet is, I don't know, how on. Could be, of course, be included to this overview of endangered poetics, such as the reduction of multiplicity to one actionable output, the operation of these algorithms, the multiplicity and variability that is essential dimension also of the poetic perspective is foreclosed, as we can see in the condensation of the algorithm functioning. But now, just to finish, 4 minutes I think I have left. We can have some last remarks of what what could involve this emergent poetics of the humans. I remember in the title I suggested to Bettina, Endangered and Emerging with an interrogation mark. She removed the interrogation mark, and I kind of felt forced to work out what emergencies we would have. And through reflection on the endangerment, I will be kind of posing some questions in this along these lines. So the bottom line is that through the micro-ontologies that are afforded by the work of Amour, the cloud ethics, and this underlying concept of deeper ethics of AI, we may be able to explore what lies under ethics, not just focusing on it after the fact. This perspective may allow to discover the micro-ontologies of relations that are generated by the grammar of machine learning algorithms. In other words, it underlines poetics. So if we go back to that preliminary outline of how the human is imagined, that would be the first degree of what sort of relationality is afforded in the second locus of poetics, and what emergent poiesis. We can keep these degrees in mind and to assess how these micro ontologies are affecting those. The assessment of how things are becoming, but could be otherwise, which is the perspective shared both by poetics and by STS, Science and Technology Studies. So we can go back to this initial summary and remember that poetry is not a genre, but is a particular awareness of the world, is a perspective, on these three loci, and look to the three degrees. As far as action transformation is concerned, we can see that the actionable output that machine learning algorithms afford is this kind of modern, ironic translation of traditional poiesis, how word affects, directly transforms the environment. But in what relation to the environment? According to what principles? According to the modification, to what kind of modification of relations? So how environments are adapted? So is the case that communities are still adapting to environments, or is it working the way around, and through which assumptions and consequences? In the level of the interactional, I mentioned previously that how clusters of attributes are latent in the data streams that are extracted from multiple sources, from Twitter and Facebook to databases of resorts. So these massive flows of data are the result of exploiting actually our instinct of relationality. Through the free connectivity provided by the internet, we blindly translate ourselves into data. So this feeds and falls an irrelational system, paradoxically. A system that is made possible thanks to our relational instinct that is driving us to maximize our personal interconnectivity. So as for the emergent poetics that we could see here is remembering the Dalabon and the machine learning. Personhood is redesigned in terms of individuals. A common pattern of language is both in traditional small-scale economies and in the algorithmic regimes of the global economics. But the consequences are very different, as we have sketched. We're going from language being as the most massive art that we know, as famously Sapir put it in the 20s, to language processing being processed in the hands of just a few. So how can an emergent poetics subvert and redress this redesign of human and of language that is going in these directions? As far as the cognitive is concerned, the first degree of poetics, there is this aspect that is really ongoing and is being highlighted from time to time, concerning that we may end up adapting our way of being human, seeing and feeling, to be machine readable and writable, to be interpreted, and in a sort of feedback loop will end up transforming our way of seeing and feeling in ways that probably we are not totally aware of. This would very much add a new instance to what Stephen Levinson, cognitive linguist, already wrote back in the 90s, when he said that to talk about what we see and feel, we have to see and feel in terms we can talk about. So if we transpose this to the machine processing, well, we can project probably some new avenues. The emergent poetics in the cognitive approach to poetics could be ambivalent. In the sense of could be eradicated in the ambivalence of this fact that seeing and feeling in terms we can talk about. It could probably add new ways of seeing. Of course, computer vision is there to the knowledge of that, but we have to be still vigilant of how. Avenues of co-creativity, of course, between carbon-based language speakers and algorithmically based language models, to paraphrase artist Mark America. And this is actually in this cognitive dimension where emergent poetics finds its natural milieu. For this cognitive line is attuned to the language communication ideology, which is at the origin of AI, the AI, informational logic. So it is actually the key human attribute of relationality and action, where the critical issues arise, and where the endangered poetics can work as a symptom of potentially irreversible transformations and damages and harms. So in any case, as Lauren Berland famously said, we live in a state of impasse, a moment where existing social imaginaries and practices no longer produce the outcomes they once did, but no new imaginaries or practices having yet created. And it seems, however, important that in the meantime, humans actively participate in the creation of those new imaginaries, and that we exercise our own poetic surveillance. So I leave it here. I think it's beyond the time. So that's it. Thank you very much.